Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We're so glad to have you here with us today. We have a couple of housekeeping announcements before we get started. On behalf of the California Labor Lab and NIOSH Center of Excellence for Total Worker Health, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. You are going to be muted during this presentation. If you have a question, please go ahead and enter it into the online Q&A box, and we'll save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the California Labor Lab and Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page within the next 5 business days. And all participants who logged in with their registration email for the full live presentation will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the evaluation form that will qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Once the evaluation form is completed, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. Just a note that Total Worker Health is a registered trademark of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And our funding is from NIOSH. We're part of the Total Worker Health program. Our mission is to extend the pursuit of health and safety for workers in traditional employment to those in a wide range of alternate arrangements in partnership with affected communities. And also next month, we're going to be having a presentation on surveying California's working age population, methods, gaps, and policy implications. And we'll be joined by Dr. Ed Yellen, Todd Hughes, MS, and Mark Baldassari, PhD. And that'll be moderated by Victor Rubin, MCH, PhD. And we're also thrilled to announce our upcoming conference, Work is Changing, Our Protections Keeping Up. This will be hybrid, available both in person in Sacramento, California, and online via Zoom. That'll be on Tuesday, April 28th. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Yellen to introduce our presenter for today.
Great, and it's a real pleasure to invite Nari to give this webinar. Nari is both an esteemed researcher at the Labor Center at Berkeley, and also a member of the California Labor Lab, and where she has made tremendous contributions to our work in understanding issues for which she's an expert. And she's also methodologically an expert on how to do a good job of surveys. Nari has served as the director of the Retirement Security Program at the UC Berkeley Labor Center since 2014. Her research focuses primarily on the U.S. retirement crisis, including policy solutions to preserve and enhance retirement benefits for low and middle wage workers and amid declining pension coverage. Her analysis of retirement wealth disparities has informed state and national policy debates. She also conducts research on the long-term care sector, unpaid family caregiving, social and service, certain insurance and safety net programs affecting aging, older workers, and workforce development. Dr. Rhee was appointed by the California State Senate to the CalSavers Retirement Savings Board in July of last year, and has been a member of the National Academy of Social Insurance since 2014. She has multiple degrees, all from the University of California, BA in anthropology from UC Santa Cruz, an MA in urban planning from UCLA, and a PhD in geography from UC Berkeley in 2007. Without further ado, Dr. Rhee.
Thank you, Ed. That's very kind. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and make sure I have control. Okay, perfect. So today I'm going to talk about sort of two chunky interrelated topics. One is, retirement inequality, so inequality that is baked into the U.S. retirement system and the major changes that have happened since the 1980s. So on that front, I'm going to talk about the three key pillars of the U.S. retirement system: Social Security, workplace pensions, and private savings. The large-scale shift in costs and risks onto workers that has happened over time, and some of the key outcomes related to savings levels and wealth concentration. The second part of this talk is going to be about what is happening to older workers in the context of these changes. And so the top line is that, workers are financially squeezed to work longer, and some do, but many can't. So we're going to be looking at just some key statistics in terms of what's been happening to labor force participation rates among older people and also leading up to retirement. Um, and then briefly discuss, three key constraints on employment at older ages, which is sort of less stable attachment to work, health issues, and gendered caregiving responsibility. Okay. So, you know, we used to talk about the US retirement system as a three-legged stool, but the fact is that the size of each pillar, right, and the significance of each pillar really depends on your kind of income and wealth level. So for the vast majority of workers, Social Security is going to be kind of your foundational layer of retirement income. For low-wage workers, that's pretty much all you're going to have in retirement. And then the second layer of retirement income is job-based retirement benefits, traditionally pensions, but increasingly 401ks. And then finally, private household savings, including home equity. So the overall, aim of retirement income is to sustain your pre-retirement standard of living, right, after you finish your working life. Uh, and to do that, you need income replacement, right? So the first kind of major, most significant layer of income replacement comes from Social Security. Um, and there's a lot of stuff on this slide, but the key thing that I want to say is that Social Security is essentially a nearly universal mandatory compulsory system, right? So if you have any earnings, you're supposed to be paying into the system. And you are automatically included in the system, right? Subject to citizenship and residency requirements. Um, the system allows people to share kind of key risks related to longevity at the population scale, and there's also generational sharing, right? Intergenerational sharing of the costs and risks. I'll give you one example. So your retirement benefits under Social Security is pegged to your highest 35 quarters of wages that are indexed, right? So it's not indexed to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which doesn't actually reflect generational changes in the standard of living. It measures changes in prices. So Social Security indexes your earnings for benefit calculation purposes to the average wage index. So what that allows people to do is share in at least some of the sort of the generational improvements in wages and the generational improvements in the standard of living. And what it's also done is that as wages have become more unequal, it's kind of helped boost low wage workers' benefits in a way that they would have really lost ground because low wage workers just don't experience the kind of career cycle wage growth that, say, sort of middle income college educated workers do. The system is funded by taxes on earnings, and employers and employees share the cost. If you're self-employed, you share that cost on your own. You bear that cost on your own. The system is currently facing some unfavorable demographics, basically fewer workers per beneficiary. It's entirely fixable, but right now there's just been decades of gridlock in terms of actually legislating a fix. Okay. So the next layer is employer-sponsored retirement benefits. This is just an excerpt from one of my reports, but mainly defined benefit pensions are retirement plans in which the employee is guaranteed a certain level of benefit, usually based on your years of service with that employer and your earnings history. And in the private, and the employer essentially bears ultimate responsibility legally for funding the promised benefits. When when if you're in a pension in the private sector, just due to a bunch of tax laws, it's the employer who is fully responsible for funding the plan. Most public pensions are jointly funded by employers and employees, right? And that includes the UC pension as well. The defined contribution plan is basically like a 401k account or another kind of investment account, 403b, right? 457 plans in the governmental sector. And those are plans in which there are basically no guarantees. The only thing that is defined, and it's not really defined, is the contribution, which may or may not, right? Employer contributions may or may not be involved. It might be a match. They might just put in a straight percentage, right? There are lots of ways of doing that. The main thing is the employer responsibility in the system is very limited to administering the plan, right? Usually through a third-party provider. And they have fiduciary responsibility, like they have legal sort of duty to employees to select low-cost investment options. And other than that, the individual worker assumes all the investment risk. You get what you get after, several market cycles when you're ready to retire, and then you end up with a lump sum that you have to figure out how to draw it down, right, to serve as some sort of income source. So, so having said that, so there's been like kind of sea changes in the US retirement system over the last generation. So in Social Security, the full retirement age for collecting kind of the full benefit increased incrementally from 65 to 67. And what that is a benefit cut, right? So if you retired at age 65 now, you're going to wind up with a lower income replacement rate compared to someone a couple of decades ago who had a normal or full retirement age of 65 under the old policy. The other major shift is the decline of traditional pensions and the rise of 401ks. And that has meant a significant shift in both risks and costs onto individual workers. Another key factor is increasing life expectancy, although there is also growing inequality in life expectancy by, socioeconomic status. What that also means is you have potentially longer retirement that you need to fund. So the combined impact of all of this is an increased private savings burden. So that top part of the pyramid, right, what's supposed to go into that has actually increased for the same kind of standard of living. So in addition to that, the US system has a major huge holes in the US employer-based retirement system because it's entirely voluntary, right? It is up to the employer to decide whether or not they want to offer a plan. So the first thing I want to point out in this chart is that there just has not been that much movement and coverage over the last several decades. And so almost half of wage and salary employees currently do not participate in any kind of retirement plan. There's a number of factors. They may be working for an employer who just doesn't offer a plan, or they do and they don't qualify under the plan rules, right? They haven't worked there long enough or don't have enough hours, or they did not opt in. A lot of plans are opt-in, so you have to take action. So there's a lot of behavioral friction there. And so for various reasons, about half of American workers are not actually participating in this plan. And this is really important because this is sort of the key, retirement plans are the key way in which American workers accumulate retirement assets outside of Social Security. And it often is the largest financial asset they have if they have a retirement account or a pension. So most of the retirement coverage gap is in the private sector. So this chart shows retirement plan participation rates by wage quartile. And so right off, you can see that there's a lot less inequality by wages in terms of retirement plan coverage in the public sector. This is for state and local government, whereas there's a huge gap between the basically less than a quarter of the lowest quartile being in the plan in the private sector versus 80% of the top quartile. Another thing I want to sort of just point out here underlying this is also a sort of a different earnings distribution because in the public sector, you just have a lot less wage inequality. Workers, who are college educated, take a little bit of a pay cut in return for things like pensions and more secure benefits. Um, and then there's a little bit of a wage premium at the bottom. And so there's just a different value set happening in the public sector, partly because it's government, partly because it's highly unionized. So let's talk about outcomes, right? Most people now have 401ks if they have a retirement plan instead of a pension, or if you're very fortunate, like we are at UC, we have access to both, right? Most career employees have access to both. So, one of the things I always highlight is the fact that there are just there are trillions of dollars in the retirement savings system, and most of it is at the top, right? So kind of the what's happening on Wall Street and how that's inflating retirement account values, that actually doesn't reflect the economic reality for your typical household. So if you look at just age 55 to 64 approaching retirement, the mean balance is $195,000, again, across all households in that age group. Whereas it's just 20,000 if you look at the median. And what's happening there is like about 40% of households age 55 to 64 have no retirement account. Um, There's also just an extreme degree of concentration in the 401k and IRA system. So IRAs are individual retirement accounts. Unlike 401ks, are not generally not employer sponsored. It's for individual people. If they have any earnings, they can go and contribute, right, and open up an account. And most of the wealth in the IRA system is actually rollovers from 401ks from when people left their jobs or retired. So, retirement asset inequality in the defined contribution system among older adults it's first of all, it's really bad and it's actually gotten worse. So if you looked at it 2022, you'll see that about two-thirds, right, of aggregate retirement account balances are owned by the top 20%, top 10% of households. And then the next 10% owns 20%. So that's basically like 86%, but the top 20% owns more than 86% of assets. The bottom 70%, which is a little insane to talk about the bottom 70%, right? Basically the vast majority of American households that are approaching retirement, they only have, less than 5% of assets. And that share has actually gone down since 2007. So, one of the things that's happened as the retirement system has switched over to 401ks from pensions is that it has helped increase overall wealth inequality. And there have been several studies by Federal Reserve economists. And I also kind of did one that actually focused on the effects of public pensions. The defined benefit pension sector tends to be much more equally distributed in terms of all indicators, in terms of kind of the imputed wealth that you can get from that lifetime income stream, tends to be fairly well distributed by things like education and race. And in the public sector, women own the majority of pension wealth in the public sector. This is from another data set from my colleagues over at the National Institute on Retirement Security, which took individual retirement account balances and individual net worth and compared it to really, just a disclaimer, really kind of crude rule of thumb financial industry benchmark for how much you should have saved over time, right, at different ages based on your current earnings. So it's really a multiple of your current earnings that you should have saved. And it maxes out at something like 10 to 12%. So by the time you retire that you're supposed to have. And that's where you get something like 1.5 million that you're supposed to have in a 401k, which very few people have. That's where that target comes from. So you can see that there's just not, first of all, that the median ratio of retirement account balances to that target is just pretty low, right? It's pretty abysmal. Um, you see people with bachelor's degrees and advanced degrees doing a little bit better, right? 12% of the median kind of ratio is 12% for people with bachelor's degrees, 16% for people with advanced degrees. Now, to be fair, households hold a lot of private assets that are not in the retirement account system. So if you just look at overall net worth, most of that is going to be in home equity. The only people who are doing, at the median doing pretty well getting approaching the target is Asian Americans. It's been interesting to see the data on Asian Americans changing over the last 2 decades as a researcher. Just over the last 2 decades, what's really happened, Asians used to sort of trail whites, right, and do better than Black and Latino households. But they've now surpassed white households, um, and it has a lot to do with just sort of the high-skilled workers who've been imported to work in sectors like technology and finance. So the main thing is that, I mentioned that households have this increasing savings burden because of changes in the retirement system, and what's happening is they're just not, most people are just not meeting those targets. So I'm gonna switch next to what this means for older workers. So, both in terms of financial realities and also kind of the policy thrust, right? Changing the retirement age to 67, full retirement age from 67 to 65 for Social Security. And, what a lot of academics and policy experts are saying is, well, people just have to work longer. And people have been responding to that pressure in terms of, older worker labor market participation rates increasing, but they're also just really kind of basically a lot of people retire before they might have intended to or before normative retirement age because of a lot of factors that are outside of their control. So the first thing, I worked up this slide for a blog post on the kind of the disproportionate impact that Medicaid work requirements or work documentation requirements are going to have on older workers. So the main thing is that the normative retirement age might be 65. But in reality, after, age 50, late 40s, going into age 50, employment just starts to drop off very quickly. And so for men, the labor market participation rate kind of peaks in their 40s at something like 88%. And by their kind of early 60s, they're down to 65% labor force participation rate. For women, right, it's always going to be lower. It goes from something like 78% in their late 40s to 55%. So it's a very precipitous drop in employment. At the same time, people are working longer, right? And so what's also happened historically is that over the last couple of decades, labor force participation rates among older adults have gone up, both among men and women. Um, and so the total rate for both sexes combined is about 20% as of 2024. There was, as we know, a big drop off in employment among older workers and sort of disproportionately among women during the pandemic. And so it looks like things are just starting to recover, but we're not quite there yet, back to 2019 levels. So I'm going to talk about what's driving um, that increase over time, the long-term increase in older workers. And it's fueled by kind of several different things happening at the same time. So the first thing that I want to sort of highlight is that just people who are more educated have always tended to work longer. It has to do with the difference in the kinds of jobs they have access to, which is just jobs that you're more able to do physically at older ages. You can think about things like dentists and lawyers, right? And they might, so there's just more employment, including self-employment among people um, with a bachelor's degree or higher. Now, the participation rate actually hasn't increased for people with advanced degrees, right? It was 26.4 in 2000. It's 26% now. So there's been basically no change. It's ticked up a little bit for people who topped out at a bachelor's degree. And then as you go down to people with a high school degree, basically, or less, that population, their older adult labor market participation rate has gone up by basically by 50%, right, in relative terms. And also it's gone up by about 5 percentage points, which is the largest kind of absolute increment increase. And at the same time, there's been a change in the educational attainment mix of older adults. So back in 2000, two-thirds of seniors had no college education at all. And that proportion shrank to 41% in 2024. So they still make up a plurality among the educational levels as I've broken them out. And so that plus the large scale increase in labor force participation among people with high school or less has really driven a lot of the increase. So basically, long and short of it is like, yes, there are a lot of groups of people are working longer, but it's really people with less education who are sort of carrying the most of the change in most of the increase in labor force participation. I hope that makes sense. I can explain it later if I need to. Um, okay, so I'm going to go over sort of three sets of factors that make it difficult, right? And then we do need to address this in policy terms because basically not everybody can uh, work until 65 or 67. Um, so one key set of factors has to do with attachment to jobs. And so employment is just more precarious at older ages by a number of different indicators. If you look at sort of discouraged workers or long-term unemployed statistics or basically, what happens is that it's easier to lose a job when you're older, and then once you are out of a job, it's harder to find a new one, especially in your usual occupation. So there's a lot of downward mobility that happens for workers who basically, had a middle class job and then wind up driving Uber, right? Because they can't find a comparable job. Some of that is due to age discrimination. And in California, it's a big issue because it's, you know, in certain sectors like tech, age discrimination is pretty overt and rampant. Um, so that's one factor. It's hard to keep a job and it's hard to also find a job when you're over 50. The other big thing is health constraints. So you just start to see, and I'm given the crowd that I'm talking to right now in occupational health, right? You just start to see more injuries, more chronic illness, right? More health conditions that interfere with ability to work after age 50. And then there's another factor, which is that, for people who do physical jobs, so it's blue collar workers, but it's also, if you can think of people who do house cleaning or building cleaners, right? Some of these are more feminized jobs that are still very physical. Um, and so they start their careers at younger ages and they're forced to retire earlier just because they can't meet the physical demands of the job. And they're increased risks of having your career derailed if you wind up with an injury or illness, even though I do understand that overall occupational injury rates tend to be lower for older workers because there are other mitigating factors. And then finally, there's caregiving responsibility. So these numbers are a little dated, so you have to kind of inflate them a little bit. But there's an estimate of $600 billion worth of unpaid elder care, mostly provided by women in the US. And that basically, when you step back from your job or reduce your hours to take care of a family member, particularly your spouse, right? And it's often most of the time it's the women taking care of their husband. There's about $300,000 in lost earnings and benefits, including retirement benefits. So now I would say that overall, the people who are doing the most caregiving in general are younger people, particularly right now, millennials, who are, so millennial women are both working and taking care of young children. I think, Ed, for the data brief that we did on caregiving out of the California Work and Health Survey, one finding was that the average millennial woman who has a young child combined has a combined work and caregiving hours of 100 hours a week. So it's pretty intense. But at the same time, older people are much more likely to be caring for other older people. And so basically there's a lot of, leaving the labor force, leaving your job earlier than planned or cutting back on your work hours, and that comes at a financial cost. So I am going to talk about some of the policy implications. I understand that the current political climate isn't necessarily conducive to some of these proposals, but the first thing and the most important thing policy wise is to strengthen Social Security financing. And to enhance benefits for low-wage workers, blue-collar workers, and caregivers. So the National Academy, I see those laughs. The National Academy of Social Insurance did an opinion poll where they basically surveyed people with a whole bunch of policy trade-offs and sort of figured out what was a popular reform package that could also fix the system. And key elements were to tax earnings above 400,000. Right now, high earners basically stop paying into Social Security at a certain point in the year, right? And then the rest of their earnings aren't taxed. So this would basically maintain the current cap, which I think is around 170,000. And then there's a donut hole, and then after 400,000, the amount of earnings before that would be taxed. And in addition to that, it's a gradual increase of 1% in the payroll tax for Social Security for both workers and employees. So it's a 2% combined over time. Um, and what's also popular is basically cutting benefits is extremely unpopular among Americans, and this goes across the political spectrum. And there's also support for enhancing benefits for women who take time off of work to raise children, for kind of workers in physically demanding jobs who just can't make it to that full retirement age to have some sort of bridge benefit for them to be able so that they're not penalized, right, for having had a blue collar job. And and other kinds of sort of tailored enhancements, and also a COLA increase for seniors who are currently receiving Social Security. So there is broad public support. Unfortunately, there's gridlock. The other major piece is universal workplace retirement plan coverage. Um, because our current system covers about half of workers, right? And given that you're really supposed to be participating in some sort of retirement scheme over your entire career consistently to have what you need. And otherwise, it just gets very, very expensive to start saving later in life or be saving sporadically. You're just not going to meet those retirement savings goals. So there are two models for this that come from the UK and Australia. So Australia has what is called a superannuation system. And basically, they have mandated that every employer put every employee, including dependent, independent contractors, into a job-based retirement plan, and they contribute, I believe it is at least 9%, it could be 12%, but basically there's significant employer contributions into that system. But the main thing is it's basically compulsory. Everyone's in a superannuation fund if you work. The UK has a different structure, which is basically kind of mandated auto enrollment plus opt out. So uh, employers are required to either auto enroll their employees into their own pension or retirement savings scheme. And if they don't, those workers need to go into the National Employment Savings Trust. So it's a nationalized retirement savings plan that serves as a sort of a second layer of income in addition to what is their own social security system. The contribution rates for employers are low, but right now their workplace retirement plan coverage rate is 88%. So didn't get to 100%, but it's a lot higher than about the 50% that we have in the US. Um, so there have been kind of proposals around an automatic IRA type system. The states are kind of trying to do this at the state level through these automated IRAs. I'm on the board of a California plan, which is called CalSavers. But really, there needs to be a national system because the states are just very constrained by federal law from doing a lot of what they need to with these programs. Finally, with regard to the retirement plan universe, fair tax subsidies for retirement plans. So the top 20% richest, kind of the highest income households get more than 80% of the tax benefit from the tax code. That's changing a little bit because they've made incremental sort of improvements in the sort of the tax credits and savings matches offered to low income individuals if they save for retirement. But it's a very upside down system where most of the money goes towards the people who need it the least, right? And it just becomes a way for very affluent people to essentially kind of tax shelter money that they would have saved anyway. And then finally, long-term supports and services are really important uh, for a whole bunch of reasons, but just related to kind of the retirement security puzzle. Um, there are two dimensions of this. The first dimension is that it's a major expense, and most people aren't prepared for it. It is not something that you can adequately insure for individually. So there is a private long-term care insurance market, but it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And there are sort of state experiments with social insurance models, again, to sort of more broadly share these risks and costs, like we do with Social Security. And then the other impact is that, that would sort of help alleviate some of the impacts on older workers who have to take time off, basically have to reduce their work hours or just drop out early from their employment in order to take care of a loved one, right? That we do need long-term care investments that are public investments to try to take some of the pressure off. Okay, I think I will conclude with that. And I welcome any comments or questions.
Great. Nari, this is like 101 for what each of us needs to do and what we as a society need to do to prepare for um, being what I already am, older. And there are a bunch of questions in there, and I urge anybody else who has questions to put them in the Q&A, but let's start with several that are there. The first says, what are the financial advantages and disadvantages of retiring at age 62 compared to age 65? Specifically, does claiming Social Security benefits at 62 rather than waiting until 65 result in a significant long-term loss due to the permanently reduced monthly benefit, and how should that trade-off be evaluated?
Yeah. So, if you're kind of average health for your age, right? I mean, everything changes if you have a terminal illness, then you want to just claim all your benefits as soon as you can. But what does tend to happen, because I work in the pension world and work with a lot of actuarial data, um, that people do not, they really sort of steeply discount their longevity risk, right? They're much more worried about getting hit by a bus tomorrow than about the fact that they could live to an age where they've completely run out of assets. So, generally speaking, at age, the benefit the benefit changes are roughly actuarially fair, and um, so I see a lot of sort of financial influencers on social media saying, "Oh, claim it at 62," and that's a huge cut in benefits, right? And for most people, really the size of that monthly income check for the rest of their life, which also comes with a full COLA, right? It fully matches inflation. That often has more value. And so really what the academic experts are saying, is if you can hold off, do, right? Sometimes you just can't, but if you have other resources to help kind of serve as a bridge so that you can claim the benefit later, you should do that. Mainly because nowhere on the market can you buy guaranteed income with that kind of COLA, right, at that price, right? You can't just take that money at 62 and take the extra and invest it and get some equivalent. That's going to be impossible to do at market prices.
Great. So the next question is, how does long-term debt like mortgages and loans affect retirement inequality? Does the top 20% have a larger share of debt, or is it equal?
Um, it's okay, let me just back up a little bit. So, what has been happening is that more and more seniors just are retiring with home mortgage debts. So it used to be that people own their homes pretty much free and clear by the time they retired. And so what's happening is that winds up increasing your cost in retirement because it's a lot cheaper to own a home that is fully paid off than to keep having to pay a mortgage. I'll also talk about another kind of debt, which is student loan debt. And so there's been a lot of research showing that people with student loan debt, now people with student loan debt are, mostly college educated, right? So they tend to be kind of in the middle to the sort of the third quartile, right, in terms of income. But that high levels of student loan debt do suppress retirement savings, right? Because you're busy paying off your loan and you don't, instead of putting that money into your retirement account. Um, and I would say like a lot of the statistics, like they do control for, you're looking at net worth, not just overall financial assets. So the net worth figure does control for debt, right? It's your assets in excess of whatever debt you have. Okay.
Yeah, so the next question is, how does tying healthcare benefits to our jobs affect savings goals and benefits later? Would untying benefits from the job allow for plan flexibility long term?
Yeah, this is kind of the issue with the American system, both in retirement and healthcare. And we haven't really come up with a fix for this, right? So, I mean, there's definitely a strong argument in the healthcare sector, and honestly, to some extent, in the retirement sector. What is useful about tying it to employment in the retirement sector is that then, right, you're um, essentially the retirement contributions come out of your wages, right? It's directly tied to that. It is directly tied to your earnings. The issue is really the policy, which is that we just have this kind of Swiss cheese voluntary system, right? Uh, you can, there's a couple of different models, but you can actually have an employer-based system that is universal, like they do in Australia.
Great. Um, Next question opens with a comment. Thanks for the eye-opening presentation. You illustrate how people with lesser levels of education are increasingly working past age 65. Do you have information on what industries this population is working in? If if they are staying in industries with higher injury rates, what are the possible impacts to access to other public benefits such as SNAP, food stamps, or Medicaid?
Yeah, so there, I think here's the thing that happens. The people who are sort of high school educated or less are generally employed in the same kinds of occupations, except again, if they're in sort of physically demanding blue collar occupations, they might have to move out of that into the service sector. So you do have increasing rates of service sector employment and like gig employment. Um, Once you get past, 60, 65. I would say though that, I think in terms of there's downward mobility that happens. The middle is what hollows out after age 65. And so
Mhm.
you just don't have access to a lot of middle income jobs anymore. So it gets separated into like doctors and lawyers and highly skilled people on the one hand, or people kind of working in kind of low wage service sector jobs or kind of at a lower earnings than they used to make before.
Your Walmart greeters, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so the next question is, what can you say about current legislative efforts in California and or nationally on universal workplace retirement plan coverage?
Yeah. So, 12 states, including California. California was one of the first two or three states to actually legislate this, and I worked on it back in 2011, 2012. And so I'm currently on the board of this program. So California has a mandate, and with the newest mandate that kicked in January 1st, basically any employer that has any employee other than themselves. So if it's just, if they put themselves on payroll, they're exempt. Otherwise, every employer has to either attest that they have their own retirement plan or auto-enroll their employees into the state-sponsored plan, which is called CalSavers. It's privately administered. It's really no different from like a Vanguard or Fidelity product. And it's just kind of sponsored by the state, but it's run by private sector vendors. The issue with that program is, first of all, right now there's about 600,000 workers and aggregate assets of 1.6 billion after having been operational for about 4 years. So, or maybe 6 years. So that, it's an achievement, but you have to think about the fact that there are 14 million workers in California, private sector workers, or mostly private sector workers in California. And only about half of them maybe are covered by a retirement plan. And so there's kind of a compliance issue here. And that I think has to do with the fact that these are standalone programs. They're not, all the states are having the same issue, right? So 11 other states are doing this, and about seven other states are at some phase trying to get a program up and running. And and they all have the same kind of program design issue, which is that because it's not integrated with the current payroll tax collection system, right? They're having a really hard time sort of capturing employers, right? So it's a work in progress. But the other thing is that these state plans under federal law cannot accept employer contributions, which is a huge limitation. And that's because there is preemption under this law called the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, or ERISA. So basically, there's broad federal preemption authority over any sort of employer-funded plan. And so what that means is the federal government really needs to take some kind of action. I think, periodically there's some kind of bill that gets introduced, and I did not listen to the State of the Union. Apparently, Trump said something that meant like maybe giving workers access to something like the federal thrift plan, which is also a model that's been proposed. Who knows if it's going to get anywhere, but so we'll see.
So we have 10 minutes left, and there are 5 or 6 more questions. There's a lot of response here. So let's try and keep the
I'll speed
answers
through it.
to a minute or so. Next one is caregiving to a loved one or family member incorporates many unpaid hours. How can this be monitored as work within the Social Security system? I would point out the question answer is some of us actually, he said, or loved one or family member. Some of us do love our family members. So it's not an or, it could be an and. Um, how can
Yeah,
this be monitored as work within the Social Security system?
well, I would say the current proposal right now is for caregiving for children. I mean, you know, um, there have been proposals to also offer credits for caregiving at older ages. But I want to say something, which is, California has a program called In-Home Supportive Services, that is a Medicaid funded program to provide in-home care to people with disabilities or limitations. Uh, Most of the they call it the consumer base. I don't like the language of consumers, but that is the language that is used. Is people over 65, and 70% of the caregivers who are paid by the program are family members. And so there was a massive expansion of that program, but it faces major challenges right now because of the Medicaid cuts that are coming down the pike.
The next question takes us into occupational health issues. How about workers with occupational injuries or cancer affecting their health with impact on their employment status? Some might be relatively young age, like engineered stone silicosis affecting migrant workers in California.
Um, Ed, do you want to maybe address that or?
Um, well, I would just say that our disability compensation and workers' compensation system in the US is really not well designed to take care of people who have 40 or 50 years left before their normal age of retirement. They're not geared for those numbers,
Yeah,
and they're not geared for the magnitude of the wage loss that
yeah,
occurs. So
yeah.
um, there might be others in the audience who are more practiced in these issues than I am. But moving on, how do programs like California's caregiver program help decrease the economic hardships on elderly caregivers?
Um, are we talking about IHSS or a different program?
Um,
I'm not entirely sure what that refers to. So,
Maybe it
yeah.
does refer to the IHSS program, but it didn't say in the question.
Okay.
So the question is how, let's just assume that it was the in-home services program. How do they help decrease the economic hardships on elderly caregivers?
Yeah, I mean so the IHSS program, you're getting paid for the caregiving, authorized caregiving hours. Now it's not very much, right? It's just a little bit above the minimum wage. The jobs are unionized. Right now there is, the two unions who have organized the workforce, SEIU and AFSCME, which is called United Domestic Workers, UDW, have been trying to consolidate collective bargaining from the county level, happens across the 50 odd counties in California, to the state level, hopefully to get more leverage and also just kind of a more coherent workforce development policy for the sector.
Mhm.
Um, again, everything is sort of hit a wall because of the Medicaid cutbacks, but that is a long-term plan. The other thing I wanted to say was that I'm part of a policy roundtable with unions and sort of aging advocates and sort of caregiving community-based organizations that are looking at sort of a roadmap to universal long-term care in California. And so, really the two critical pieces of that are a social insurance model, which will sort of help either, help pay for benefits and pay for care and take some pressure off of families. Um, and then again, expanding the Medicaid sector. But this is a long-term plan. Probably
A
not in
lot
this
more
administration.
questions, so let's do them rapid fire.
Okay,
For the
we'll try.
slide of ratio of net worth to retirement savings, Black had the lowest
Mhm.
percent at
Yeah,
15. How much
yeah.
of this is due to differential in education, wages, benefits, real estate, assets ownership, or all of the above?
It really is all of the above. It is, unless they're in the private, public sector. So I did a report really showing how public pensions are kind of a pillar of the Black middle class. But other than that, there's lower rates of home ownership, less home equity, and kind of lower lifetime earnings. Particularly for Black men, just much more sort of insecurity when it comes to employment, right? More sort of bouts of unemployment. And
Right.
so all of that just kind of combines and really holds down, right? And also the other big factor is a lack of generational wealth.
Right. So, next question. Sorry if this was discussed, but how does the retirement plan that President Trump mentioned in the State of the Union square with other efforts that exist or are being worked on locally?
Oh, yeah. So one of the proposals for how to do kind of a national, retirement plan, or at least one that maybe like the National Employment Savings Trust or is sort of catches the people who aren't in the employer-based system, is to open up the federal thrift savings plan. So the main thing is that it gives everybody uh, access to really low-cost funds. You can also buy annuities and get lifetime income at the end of it that are sort of essentially insured. And anyway, so it's not a cockamamie idea. It's just it'll be interesting to see how the legislature responds because it seemed to kind of come out of the blue. But I mean, there was he's coming out with Trump accounts, and yeah. So we'll see. I mean, I'd be surprised, but we'll see.
And we'll send you off with this great question that really sums up your entire talk. If Social Security doesn't keep up with our aging population and cost of living, and 50% of Americans don't have employer-based retirement plans, what alternatives exist for those Americans besides working longer?
Well, I think that that's the thrust of it is that people are working as long as they can, and a lot of people aren't able to. And one issue is that this is a major sort of public fiscal issue because that's going to put more strain on social safety nets, right? And then this also comes in hand with changing demographics where a lot of people don't have right, they're aging into being single, like not being partnered at increasing rates, and also
Right.
not having any children, right? So a lot of single older adults with fewer resources to fall back on. So I think this is a thing. It's that we do need one of it does mean um, bulking up the social insurance system and also the social safety net.
Great. Nari, this has been a fantastic webinar, as evidenced by the material you presented and also the attention of the audience. well over 100 people were on, and just one or two shy of 100 are still on. So we really appreciate your taking the time, and we're really honored to have you as part of the California Labor Lab. So with that, we will see all of you next month to talk about the problem of getting people to participate in surveys and what that has to do for public policy. Thank you and
You're
goodbye.
welcome. Thank you.